Tony sat in the passenger seat of Harry's white and red Kenworth, feeling every vibration of the road beneath them as they covered 1 mile after another. The odor of hot rubber filled Tony's nostrils, and the dry air blew through the open window, carrying dust that scratched his throat. 70 miles remained to Lycanthrope, or so the creased highway sign had indicated several minutes back. Harry, a cheerful driver with an easy grin, had agreed to drop Tony off in a place called Windhead before turning west toward Oklahoma. That arrangement suited Tony fine, because from Windhead to Lycanthrope was hardly a burden. He allowed his mind to wander. The rolling plains stretched outward, shimmering beneath the harsh sun. Pale grasses shifted in a faint breeze, and Tony studied the horizon with a kind of renewed appreciation. He realized how badly he had missed these flat, open landscapes during his time away. 3 years in steamy, rain-soaked jungles had left him craving wide skies and crisp distances. Where he had served, daily rains turned the ground into thick mud, and the constant roar of howler monkeys frayed his patience. Night brought its own torments from creatures that slithered and crawled, intent on disturbing any chance of rest. Combat and sleeplessness had dulled his spirit. Yet one thought kept him going. He would return with enough money to secure a future for himself and Lizzy. A small farm near Windhead, a modest house, and the comforts of married life had carried him through the worst days of that draining conflict. Beside him, Harry chattered away about the life of a trucker. He spoke of freedom on the highway, of decent pay, of family moments that felt special after days on the road. Tony listened politely, though he did not offer much. He heard Harry's hints about needing a new partner, about driving long distances without being hounded by bosses. Tony, however, had made no decisions about his future. For now, only Lizzy mattered. When Windhead's low buildings appeared, Harry slowed the big Kenworth and looked at Tony with genuine warmth. He wished Tony luck, then navigated a left turn onto another highway that would lead him away. Tony stood at the quiet edge of Windhead and watched the truck roll out of sight. A breeze fluttered his collar, carrying the distant scent of frying bacon. He strolled toward the central square. One quick glance revealed a handful of parked cars outside a nondescript bar. The clock on a nearby lamppost showed midday had already passed. Tony's stomach reminded him that he had not eaten since morning, so he stepped toward the bar, hoping to find both a meal and a ride. Lycanthrope lay several miles farther, and Tony wanted to make good time. The bar's interior smelled of stale beer and fried food. Tony scanned the tables. He saw a few men finishing lunch and a lone waitress. She was young and bore a faint resemblance to Lizzy. Tony recalled how he had met Lizzy while she was working tables at another place. This waitress approached and asked what he wanted. Tony noted her friendly gaze, but his mind hovered on Lizzy. He ordered eggs, bacon, and a beer. While waiting, he observed the patrons. They seemed like travelers, possible truckers, with heavy boots and dusty jackets. After a long stretch in the passenger seat, Tony felt eager to continue, so he finished his meal quickly. He thanked the waitress and headed for the bar to pay. The bartender, stocky and thick-armed, stared at him in a way that made Tony uneasy. "There are several cars outside," Tony said. "Do you know if any are going toward Lycanthrope?" The bartender remained silent, his eyes assessing Tony as though he were an unwelcome stranger. Tony repeated the question, feeling tension creep into his voice. "Why are you heading there?" the bartender finally asked. "I have someone waiting," Tony answered, uncertain why this even mattered. "Lizzy Crawford. Maybe you know her?" The man's silence returned, and he stared with an unfriendly expression. "I don't know her," he muttered. "And I wouldn't advise going to Lycanthrope. Best keep away." Tony frowned. Why? Just do yourself a favor and stay out, the bartender said. Order something else if you want, or get going. Tony hesitated, bewildered. The bartender's warning lacked context, but his firm tone signaled the conversation was over. Tony paid and turned to leave, unsettled by the man's remarks. At the doorway, he almost collided with a rotund policeman walking in. The officer wiped sweat from his forehead and strolled over to the bar, where the bartender leaned in and whispered something. Tony felt eyes on him and realized they were discussing him. He saw no cause for alarm. He had simply asked about a ride. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed down. A gray-haired driver cleaning his truck looked up when Tony approached. Tony asked if he knew anyone heading to Lenville. The man said nothing, climbed into his cab, fired the engine, and spoke through the open window in a flat voice. No one goes there anymore. With that, he drove off, leaving Tony in a swirl of dust. Tony stepped onto the dusty street of Windhead, leaving the bar's cramped interior behind him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air felt uncomfortably hot. He noticed how silent the place had become, as though the entire population feared something lurking just beyond sight. He refused to dwell on the uneasy glances he had received, instead focusing on his goal. A few miles under the fading light did not seem daunting, and Lenville was not far. If he kept a steady pace, he might reach its outskirts by early evening, eager to see Lizzy again. He passed a small gas station with a single pump and a vacant cashier's booth. An empty plastic bag rustled across the lot, carried by a stray breeze. The policeman's car from earlier was nowhere in sight, which provided some relief. Tony remembered how the officer had stared at him as if he were a trespasser. Every minute in Windhead had left Tony with a sense of unease, and he could not shake the bartender's warning. Still, he pressed on, deciding that no threat could outweigh his need to see Lizzy. The road ahead stretched in a gentle curve. On the horizon, sparse clumps of trees interrupted the uniformity of the plains. He reached a tilted highway marker that stated Lenville lay just 6 miles off the main route. Tony paused, recalling the many times he and Lizzy had passed this same spot in happier days. At present, the heat bore down without mercy, and the stillness around him created a stark contrast to his memories. The bartender's harsh attitude replayed in his thoughts, but Tony dismissed it. He had no intention of turning back when Lizzy waited. He drank a small amount from his canteen, then continued toward the small road leading away from the highway. The dust on his boots grew thicker with every step. As the sun dipped, the air cooled slightly, allowing Tony a bit more comfort. He observed dried-out vegetation covering the fields to his left. A warped fence ran along the opposite side, broken in multiple places. An abandoned mailbox lay near a post, its paint chipped beyond recognition. He wondered when life had last felt normal here. Each minute of walking brought him closer to an unexpected sense of loneliness, different from what he had experienced in the tropics. No howler monkeys shrieked, but the lack of anything at all had its own unsettling quality. The final stretch to Lenville took him past a deserted farmstead. The homestead's windows were boarded, and a rotted door leaned awkwardly against the frame. Tony tried to recall Lizzy's letters describing her mother's condition. He felt pangs of guilt for not returning sooner. War had trapped him in a world of violence and forced obligations. Now, he had the freedom to move as he pleased. Yet every step toward Lenville felt heavier than the last. Still, he pressed forward, unwilling to let fear or guilt take control. Soon he reached a weathered sign bearing the town's name. The painted letters had faded, and a small population figure beneath looked rubbed away. Passing that threshold, Tony entered a street lined with modest houses. Many displayed broken shutters and overgrown yards. He saw no lights in the windows. Now and then he imagined a curtain shifting, but he could not confirm if anyone was watching. The hush reminded him of the abandoned villages he had seen during raids overseas. Yet the difference was that no official presence blocked his path here. He passed 3 or 4 consecutive houses without spotting movement. Then he noticed a single figure far ahead, standing near a fence. When Tony quickened his pace, the figure slipped out of sight. He considered calling out, but decided against it. The last thing he wanted was to provoke hostility. He continued along the cracked sidewalk, scanning each yard for signs of Lizzy. He had no idea if she still lived in the same house, but he believed she would wait for him no matter what. He found a half-familiar intersection that looked like a central hub. A battered sign for Thomas Paine's Cafe caught his attention, though it hung crookedly from a rusted bracket. Lizzy had once mentioned that cafe. Perhaps she had worked there at some point. Tony approached with caution. The windows were streaked with grime, and the door seemed uninviting. He tested the handle and found it unlocked. Inside, chairs sat neatly around tables, and a thin layer of dust coated the surfaces. The silence weighed on him. He ventured farther into the cafe, aware of his own breathing. He noticed footprints leading to a back room, but they appeared old. He found no one. A single overhead light fixture hung in disrepair. The place resembled a memory left to rot. He wondered if the locals had given up or simply vanished. Outside, the sky had dimmed. He decided to leave and look for a place to rest. Without a plan, he might wander until exhaustion took over. Stepping out, he looked down the empty street. The nearest house displayed no lights, but he saw a faint glow in the second-floor window of a building near the end of the block. He started in that direction, determined to discover if Lizzy resided there or if someone else might provide information. His heart pounded with the tension of uncertainty, yet he forced himself onward. He refused to abandon his search without answers. Even in this strange emptiness, Lizzy remained his guiding star, and he intended to find her despite every warning he had received. Tony moved toward the barely discernible source of light coming from the second floor of a dilapidated building at the very end of the fading street. The dusk deepened with every passing minute, and the surface of the road took on an increasingly ominous look. Overgrown yards flanked the street, some appearing abandoned for years. Tilted mailboxes, cracked paint on walls, empty dog kennels, and scattered garden tools. Each fragment made Tony wonder where the residents had gone and why no one came out to greet him. He walked about 100 yards along the narrow lane, making sure to keep the faint glow on the second floor in sight. As he neared the building, the light disappeared, but turning back wasn't an option. He approached the structure, barely making out the front door, and noticed a metal trash can knocked over on the porch, its hinges ripped out. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, mixed with stale dust. Tony reached for the door handle. It gave way immediately, creaking as it opened into the darkness of a hallway. Inside, the air was stagnant, as if the windows hadn't been opened in years. Just a few feet from the entrance stood a massive cabinet, thick with dust and cobwebs. He closed the door behind him but didn't lock it, leaving himself a way out. The floor was covered with faded scraps of carpet, partially torn up to reveal cracked wooden planks underneath. Tony took a few steps forward and saw a staircase leading upward. The wooden steps sagged and groaned under his weight. The banister was splintered, rough to the touch. He climbed about a dozen steps, but froze when he heard a faint rustling behind the wall. He couldn't tell if it was real or just his imagination, but he decided to proceed cautiously. His training had taught him that silence could be deceptive, and danger often hid in the least expected places. On the second floor, he found a landing with 3 doors, all closed. The walls were marred with dark stains, as if water had once seeped through and dried, leaving grotesque marks. A weak beam of light filtered through the gap beneath one of the doors. It could have been the source of the brief glow he'd seen from the street. Placing his hand on the rough surface of the door, he listened for any sounds but heard none. Gently he pushed. The door creaked open. The room beyond was small, with a low ceiling. A dim desk lamp glowed on a round stool. No one was inside except a cat perched on a tattered couch, its wide eyes fixed on Tony. The animal didn't flee. Instead, it seemed alert, but not frightened. Tony stepped inside and quietly closed the door. This part of the house was the most lived in. Yellowed newspapers were scattered on a small table. A stack of empty cans stood nearby, and a sour smell lingered, as though remnants of an old meal had been left to rot. He scanned the walls but saw nothing to suggest who might have lived here. The faded wallpaper, with oversized floral patterns, was moldy in the corners. A heavy curtain hung over the window, letting in only the faintest hint of night sky. Tony crouched near the couch. The cat stretched its head slightly, whiskers twitching but didn't run away. Maybe it hadn't seen a person in a long time. Tony carefully reached out, trying to scratch behind its ear. The animal tensed but didn't pull back. For a moment, Tony felt an odd sense of joy. This was the first living creature he'd encountered in Lycanthrope that wasn't just a memory. He stroked its fur, feeling its heartbeat, but his thoughts remained focused on one question. Where was Lizzy? On the couch, he noticed a torn sheet wrapped around a broken spring. Perhaps someone had used this room as a refuge, but Tony saw no personal belongings. No photographs, books, or clothes. Nothing hinted at Lizzy's presence, or that of anyone she knew. He would have to search the rest of the house for clues. He stood up and stepped back into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar. The cat didn't move, still watching him intently. Tony tried the other 2 doors on the second floor, but both were locked. The handles wouldn't budge, and he wasn't prepared to break them down unless absolutely necessary. He didn't want to go back downstairs, but he needed to ensure no one was hiding below. Returning to the staircase, he descended cautiously, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the hallway. On the ground floor, he found a tiny kitchen hidden behind a partition. An overturned stool lay on the floor, and the sink was empty. Tony tested the faucet. No water. The window overlooked an overgrown backyard, yet the space gave the impression of past activity. An old refrigerator with a broken door, shelves lined with rusting pots and pans. The cabinets had been pulled open, their contents spilled or shattered. On the floor, dirty shoe prints led to the back door, where a dried stain, likely some kind of liquid, stood out. The stench was revolting. Tony cracked open the back door and stepped onto a small porch with wooden stairs leading into the yard. In the dim evening light, he could see only waist-high weeds swaying gently. There was no movement, no sound, except for a brief gust of wind that stirred a solitary tree. He thought about the warnings he'd heard back in Windhead. What had happened here, and why was there such an oppressive silence? Returning to the hallway, he glanced up at the staircase. From the slightly ajar door above, the same weak light from the desk lamp spilled out, and the cat remained on the couch, like a sentinel of this strange sanctuary. Tony knew staying here any longer would be pointless. He resolved to head toward the town center, where the church and a few key buildings were located. Perhaps he could find someone who knew what had happened to Lizzy. He silently exited the house, pulling the door shut behind him. Looking up at the sky, he saw the moon obscured by a veil of clouds. In a yard about 50 yards away, he noticed a shadowy figure standing behind a sagging fence, seemingly watching him. Tony walked away, careful not to provoke whoever it was. The houses around him took on a sinister appearance. Under the evening sky, their peeling paint looked almost black, and no lights shone from the windows. Street lights stood with broken fixtures, leaving the street blanketed in a dim, eerie haze, though it wasn't yet late. A few steps later, Tony spotted another figure at a crossroads. As he approached, the person melted into the shadow of a nearby building. A chill ran through him, but he stayed resolute. Fear couldn't deter him from his search. Pressing on, he followed familiar landmarks, hoping for a clue that would lead him to Lizzy's house. He remembered her home being closer to a patch of green lawns and a low fence. As he rounded a corner, the silhouette of an old church came into view. Its spire, though worn, was the only part of the building that seemed intact. Tony decided to head there, hoping he might find someone who could shed light on the whereabouts of the missing people and Lizzy. Tony walked along the dark street toward the distant silhouette of the old church. The air felt stale and carried the scent of rotting wood. The silence pressed on him, and he noticed how each step sounded louder than normal on the uneven pavement. He passed a series of dilapidated houses, each appearing more neglected than the last. He saw peeling paint, shattered windows, and fences covered in thick layers of rust. A slight breeze rustled across the dead lawns, and no voices emerged from behind any doors. He finally reached the church grounds. The gray spire stood against the sky, and the main door faced a small, unkempt yard. Several scraggly shrubs clung to life around the building's foundation, their leaves dry and lifeless. Tony tried the door, expecting it to be locked, but the knob turned with a heavy creak. The door opened, allowing a faint draft to escape. He stepped inside and paused to gather his bearings. Within the dim interior, he recognized the simple layout: rows of benches, a narrow aisle, and a raised platform at the front. The overhead lights were off, and the only illumination came from the moonlight seeping through tall, arched windows. The stained glass sections were in poor condition, with cracks in several places. Dust particles drifted in the shadows, and the entire atmosphere felt abandoned. Tony moved forward, noticing the echo of his steps across the wooden floor. He saw a few scattered hymnals, their covers warped by humidity. A lone table near the front held a tarnished metal cross, toppled on its side. Tony reached the platform and saw a small door leading to a back room. He tested that handle, finding it unlocked. Inside, he discovered a cramped office space. A single wooden desk stood near one wall, and next to it, a tall bookcase leaned precariously, its shelves empty. Papers lay strewn on the floor, as though someone had sorted through them in haste. Tony knelt to examine the sheets. Some carried dates from 6 months before, others older. A few contained handwritten notes about local events, church fundraisers, a missing person notice, a canceled wedding, and a funeral listing for a woman named Crawford. Tony read the name carefully, realizing it might refer to Lizzy's mother. That funeral date matched the contents of Lizzy's letter from 2 years ago. The paper mentioned no other details. He felt a deep pang recalling Lizzy's desperate plea for him to return. That letter had arrived late, and he had been stuck in an assignment thousands of miles away. Now he saw the official record of the funeral, typed and signed with shaky penmanship. He also saw mention of unusual incidents around that same period, but the ink had faded, and most words were impossible to decipher. He set the pages down, stood and surveyed the office once more. Nothing else suggested Lizzy's whereabouts. He moved back into the main hall, intending to leave. Then he heard a noise. It was faint, like a single step on a loose floorboard. He froze, scanning the darkness. The sound came again, behind him. He spun around, gripping the edge of the nearest bench for support. In a far corner, a shape emerged from the shadows. Tony tried to discern features but saw only an outline. He tensed, unsure if he faced a threat or a survivor. He took one cautious step forward. The shape receded slightly, as though wary of him. Tony cleared his throat but spoke quietly. "Is anyone here?" he asked, keeping his voice level. No answer came. The figure shifted again. Tony noticed a pale reflection from what might have been eyes, but in the low light he could not be certain. He maintained his position, unwilling to rush forward. Slowly the figure straightened and moved along the side aisle toward a small door that led to a choir area. A moment later, the shape slipped through that door, leaving Tony uncertain if he should follow. His instincts warned him to remain on guard, yet the possibility of finding Lizzy or someone who knew her drove him onward. He quietly approached the door. It was slightly ajar, allowing a glimpse of a corridor that ran behind the stage. A narrow set of steps angled upward, likely leading to a cramped attic or bell tower. He thought of the shape he had just seen and wondered if it belonged to one of those silent watchers he had encountered in the street. He heard nothing else, so he climbed the steps. They creaked, and the enclosed space smelled of damp plaster and old timber. The corridor at the top ended in a small landing. By feeling along the wall, Tony located a latch. The hatch above him swung open, releasing stale air into his face. He hoisted himself into a cramped attic area. The moonlight entered through a square vent, revealing wooden beams, piles of dusty boxes, and scattered debris. Broken ceiling tiles lay in heaps. No person was visible, yet he sensed that someone had just been there. One box lay tipped on its side, its contents spilled. Old letters and a tattered photo album lay scattered. Tony crouched and shuffled through them, spotting a photograph that showed a young woman standing in a backyard, wearing a white apron. He thought of Lizzy and strained his eyes, but the picture was too faded for certainty. He heard a scraping sound near the vent. He turned and saw nothing, only the faint glow of moonlight through the opening. The boards under his feet groaned with his weight, and he feared that any sudden shift might send him tumbling. He gathered a few letters, slipped them into his pocket, and decided this place offered no direct clues. He made his way back to the hatch, descended the steps, and reached the main hall. The building remained silent and no figure reappeared. He exited the church, shutting the door softly behind him. Outside, the street lay empty. The moon had emerged from behind thinning clouds, revealing deserted yards and broken fences. Tony took a moment to compose himself. He had found a funeral notice, scattered references to bizarre events, and a fleeting stranger lurking in the church. None of it answered the question burning in his mind. He decided to head toward Lizzy's old address. He knew the approximate location of her modest home, and he hoped to discover what had become of her. Tony followed the side street until he reached the dim outline of Lizzy's old residence. In earlier years, that place had appeared modest but bright, with a small fence and a neat yard that measured perhaps 20 yards from edge to edge. Now the fence leaned at a precarious angle, and the front lawn was choked by tall weeds. The chipped paint on the porch steps looked dull under the moon, and the windows were dark. He paused near the gate, recalling how Lizzy once waved to him from this very spot. laughing while the summer sun cast hard shadows on the dusty ground. That memory felt distant now, like something belonging to another lifetime. He pushed the warped gate open, hearing its rusty hinges groan. He half expected movement in the windows or the sound of footsteps from within, but the entire structure stood silent. The boards on the porch creaked under his weight, and he realized how worn they had become in 3 short years. He saw the front door was closed but not latched. He tested the knob gently, and it gave way under his hand. He stepped inside, prepared for whatever might be lurking in the musty interior. A stale smell greeted him, and the corridor was dark, with only faint moonlight spilling through a narrow hall window. He remembered the layout of the house: a small living room on the right, a kitchen straight ahead, and 2 bedrooms on the left. The living room door stood partially open, so he peered inside first. The once vibrant wallpaper looked torn, and the furniture was coated in a heavy layer of dust. A frayed armchair leaned against a bare wall, missing one leg. The windows were shut, and the curtains were drawn, leaving the space heavy with stagnant air. He stepped inside to check for any sign that Lizzy had recently occupied the place. His boots left tracks in the dust, and he saw no footprints except his own. He noticed the same framed photos on the mantel that he remembered from earlier days. One showed Lizzy's mother, smiling in a sunlit backyard. The glass in that frame was cracked, and the image underneath had faded at the edges. Next to it, he saw a photograph of Lizzy as a child, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, holding a small dog. Tony realized he had never even learned what happened to that pet. He found the entire room unsettling in its stillness, but he forced himself to stay, hoping for any clue about Lizzy's fate. He heard a faint sound outside, almost like padded feet, moving across the yard. It could have been a dog or something else, but it passed by the house without entering. Tony remained silent until the noise faded. His pulse felt stronger than usual, and he recalled rumors about shapeshifters and strange creatures. 3 years ago, such talk would have sounded ridiculous, but after what he had witnessed so far, he could not dismiss it as nonsense. The memory of the bartender in Windhead, telling him to stay away from Lenville, replayed in his thoughts. He pushed those warnings aside and stepped back into the corridor. He headed toward the kitchen, which he remembered as Lizzy's mother's favorite room. The space was small, lined with old cabinets and a short counter. This time, the cabinet doors hung open, revealing empty shelves. The sink faucet dripped once or twice, indicating the plumbing still had some water, though he suspected it might be contaminated or stale. A chipped table stood beneath a dusty window. He tried the rear door, but it was locked from the inside. He scanned the floor for footprints or scuff marks and saw faint smears that suggested someone had been there before him, possibly weeks or months ago. His next step was the bedrooms. He paused in the corridor and listened carefully. The first bedroom door was cracked open, revealing the corner of an unmade bed. He pushed the door and let moonlight illuminate the space. Clothes lay scattered on the floor, some of them female items that might have belonged to Lizzy. He recognized a faded pink sweater she once wore in cooler months. He picked it up, noticing a torn sleeve and dark stains at the hem. He could not tell if those stains were dirt or something more distressing. He draped the sweater across a chair, noticing the silence once more. He approached the closet, remembering that Lizzy stored her favorite dresses in there. He found it empty except for a single hanger dangling at an awkward angle. The mirror on the inside of the closet door had a long crack running diagonally from corner to corner. The splintered glass revealed Tony's reflection in fractured segments, giving him a distorted view of his own face. He looked away, uneasy about the silent house that offered no explanation for her absence. He left the first bedroom and approached the second, which had belonged to Lizzy's mother. The door there was shut. He reached for the knob, but a faint scratching sound on the other side made him hesitate. He waited, holding his breath, wondering if he had triggered some hidden occupant. The sound ceased, replaced by deeper quiet. He had seen the shadows of residents lurking outside earlier, and the knowledge of possible werewolves haunted him. Gathering courage, he turned the knob and pushed the door open, letting the moonlight spill in. The small bedroom contained a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The window on the far wall was shut and the curtains were drawn, but the dim glow revealed scattered items across the floor. He saw a half-open suitcase with clothes inside. The presence of the suitcase suggested someone had tried to pack in a hurry. A single page from a letter lay near the bed, and he knelt to pick it up. The handwriting was Lizzy's. It mentioned an urgent plan to leave, but the page ended abruptly with no signature or date. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. A soft creak from the corridor drew his attention. He stood quickly and approached the open door, scanning the darkness beyond. Something moved past the window at the front of the house, blocking a sliver of moonlight for less than a second. He heard a low growl echo from the yard. It did not repeat, and the silence afterward felt unsettling. Tony decided to exit the bedroom and return to the living room, where he could watch both the front door and the windows. If someone or something prowled outside, he needed to prepare for the possibility of an encounter. He reached into his bag for a short folding knife, an inadequate weapon against any determined threat, but better than nothing. He moved toward the living room, bracing himself for what might happen next. He felt certain that he was not alone in this place, and he realized that the stories about werewolves might be more than small-town fables. Whatever had happened here, it had driven the residents away or caused them to transform into a threat unlike anything he had previously faced. The memory of Lizzy, working in that bright cafe, felt impossibly distant, yet he refused to give up hope. He would fight if he had to, but he would not leave this house without trying to uncover the truth. Tony gripped the folding knife in his right hand and stood near the living room's doorway. The faint moonlight seeping through the cracks of the drawn curtains gave him just enough illumination to observe the corridor. He heard a soft scratch at the front door, followed by a tense silence. He thought about the frantic scribbles in Lizzy's unfinished letter, recalling the mention of an urgent departure she had planned. He hoped she was far from this place, where footsteps prowled in the yard and the neighbors had turned into something monstrous by night. He forced himself to move, shifting one foot ahead and sliding closer to the window. He pressed 2 fingers against the curtain's edge and peeked outside. The yard appeared empty, but the tall weeds swayed unevenly. With the breeze nearly non-existent, that movement suggested something crouched among the tangles of dried grass. He tensed and drew back from the window, aware that a single glance might attract attention. He needed a better vantage point. He recalled that the house had a side door leading to a narrow walkway, but he also remembered the shape he had seen slipping past the window earlier. He considered whether it might be safer to remain inside, yet every instinct told him that staying in one place could trap him. The strange presence had made its intent clear. It was stalking him. He decided he would rather face it in the open than risk a blind attack in cramped rooms. He thought of his time overseas, where he had learned to engage threats head-on. He slipped down the corridor, keeping his footsteps light. The door he wanted stood near the kitchen. He reached it and slid the bolt. Before pulling it open, He listened for any sound beyond, but heard only his own heartbeat. He pushed the door a few inches, letting moonlight flood in. The backyard lay in shadows, but it seemed empty. He crouched and scanned a radius of 15 or 20 yards, seeing no clear movement. A broken fence on the far side looked like a possible escape route. He decided to step outside, gripping the knife tighter. If any creature lurked behind the house, it would have to cross open ground to reach him. The air smelled stale and carried the faint odor of decaying leaves. He advanced carefully, glancing at the corners of the structure. An old water barrel leaned against the siding, half crushed under its own weight. A pile of discarded boards lay behind it, forming a small mound. Nothing sprang from the darkness. He kept going, heading for the gap in the fence. If the front yard was compromised, perhaps circling around would give him a path back toward the street. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the side of the yard. He froze, trying to pinpoint the source. It emerged again, deeper this time, sending a chill through his body. He pivoted, placing his back toward the house. The silhouette of a large figure appeared near the collapsed fence, roughly 30 yards away. He could not distinguish features, but it seemed taller than an ordinary person, with broad shoulders and a crouched stance. The moonlight revealed patches of thick hair along the neck and arms. It stood there, as if challenging him, and he realized that the rumors about infected or cursed residents were no exaggeration. He was staring at a beast-like shape, neither fully human nor fully animal. His grip on the knife tightened, though he knew this small blade was inadequate. He took a slow step backward, intending to retreat to the house. But the creature lunged forward several paces, crossing 5 or 6 yards in an instant. Tony fought the urge to run. If he sprinted blindly, he might give the beast an easy target. Instead, he held his ground, raising the knife to chest level. The figure snarled, baring teeth that glinted in the moonlight. Each breath it took sounded like a raspy intake of air through a wide muzzle. He spoke with as much steadiness as he could muster. "I don't want to fight you." The creature lowered its head and pawed the ground as if testing its footing. Tony noticed its limbs were human-like in proportion, but the face and the thick fur told another story. He thought of the townspeople who stood by fences earlier, watching him. Perhaps they all carried this curse, waiting for darkness to reveal their true forms. He recalled how the bartender in Winhead had told him to stay away. He now understood the bartender's grim warning. The beast rushed forward, covering another 10 yards in a flash. Tony reacted, stepping aside, though there was little space to maneuver. He slashed the air with the knife, hoping to deter an immediate leap. The creature halted just out of reach, growling with renewed ferocity. Tony could smell its rank breath. He braced himself, searching for a path to the rear door. If he could lure it around the corner, maybe he could slip inside and block the entrance. Then he might search for a stronger weapon. He took a calculated risk, faking a run to the left. The creature lunged, swiping with an elongated claw. Tony dodged to the right, stumbling into the shadow of the water barrel. He nearly lost his balance, but stayed upright. The beast twisted around, seeming to move on 2 legs at times, and then on all 4s when it lunged. Its eyes glowed with a bestial intelligence that both fascinated and terrified him. He retreated back toward the open door, but the beast sprang forward again, cutting off his retreat. Tony swung the knife, grazing the thick fur on its shoulder. The creature let out a pained snarl, but showed no sign of backing down. Instead, it advanced, jaws snapping. Tony kicked a piece of rotten board from the ground, aiming to distract it. The beast stepped on the board, splintering it to bits. Tony felt trapped. The yard was too confined, and the monster outmatched him. He realized that if he did not find cover, he would be quickly overwhelmed. He glanced behind him, saw a gap at the corner of the house, and ran for it. The beast pursued, leaping forward with incredible speed. Tony just managed to slip around the house's side, narrowly avoiding a set of claws that raked the siding. Sparks flew as the nails scraped metal or exposed nails in the wood. He ducked under a sagging gutter and slid toward the front yard, knife still in hand. He heard the beast behind him, snarling as it tried to navigate the corner. The front yard lay open, illuminated by the moon. Tony glimpsed the gate where he had first entered. If he could reach it, maybe he could make it to the street. Yet he also knew that fleeing might lead him straight into more creatures if they roamed the roads. The werewolf came around the corner with a guttural roar. Tony forced himself to keep moving, ignoring the pain in his ankle from his abrupt pivot. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the beast closing in. It covered the ground in long bounds, exuding raw power that dwarfed any threat Tony had previously encountered. Despite his pounding heart, he refused to give up. He would fight as long as he had breath, and he would not die without knowing Lizzy's fate. Tony pressed himself against the rotting fence, scanning the moonlit yard for anything he could use to level the odds. The werewolf advanced with ragged snarls, closing the gap to 10 yards. Tony's heart hammered and his lungs burned. He was out of breath, and his slim folding knife felt useless against the hulking shape ready to spring. He glanced toward the battered porch, where a broken rocking chair lay on its side. Farther along on the right edge of the yard, he spotted a tool shed, gray paint peeling, its door half off the hinges. At first it looked like one more decrepit outbuilding in a dying town, but the memory of farm tools or yard equipment stirred hope. Perhaps he could find a crowbar, a shovel, or even a rusted axe. Anything with more reach and impact than his small blade. The creature snarled again, forcing Tony to stay alert. Despite his fatigue, Tony sprinted across a short stretch of yard, his feet sliding on dead grass. The werewolf rushed forward, bounding from side to side with unnatural agility. Tony threw himself onto the porch and rolled behind the broken chair, hearing splinters crack beneath him. The beast skidded to a stop just short of the steps, as though sizing up whether to pounce or flank him. Tony inhaled, trying to calm his pounding heart. He spotted a jagged wooden leg from the shattered rocking chair, about half a yard long, lying loose. He snatched it and brandished it in his left hand, dropping the flimsy pocket knife into his right coat pocket. This makeshift club was no sword, but it beat fighting barehanded. He risked a quick glance to the tool shed, roughly 15 yards away. If he could draw the monster away, maybe circle around, he could slip inside for a real weapon. He threw the chair leg at the beast, hoping to distract it. The improvised projectile spun end over end, catching the werewolf on the shoulder. It let out a furious bark and leaped onto the porch, cracking loose boards with its weight. Tony scrambled sideways, nearly losing his footing as he landed in a patch of weed-choked dirt. A sliver of broken board sliced his forearm through his shirt, and he hissed at the sudden sting. The creature lunged, and he felt its hot breath graze the back of his neck. He rolled once more, evading a savage swipe by mere inches. Using every ounce of adrenaline, Tony dashed around the corner of the house, his boots kicking up dust. The yard behind him erupted in noise, snarls, claws scraping wood, and the creak of a fence about to give way. He kept his eyes on the tool shed. 10 yards, 8, 5. A savage roar spurred him onward. At the threshold of the shed, he yanked the half-detached door, forcing it wide enough to slip inside. He turned, slammed it shut, and dropped the crude sliding bolt into place. He backed away from the entrance, panting. The interior smelled of damp earth and decaying lumber. Faint moonlight poured through cracks in the walls, revealing vague silhouettes of tools and junk heaped haphazardly. He heard the werewolf outside, breathing heavily as it circled the shed. Its claws scraped the wood near the door, sending small vibrations through the flimsy structure. He knew this barricade wouldn't hold for long against such a brute. Tony squinted at the clutter, searching for any potential weapon. His gaze snagged on a tall metal cabinet in the corner, partially rusted and lacking a proper latch. He rushed over, grabbed the handle, and yanked. It stuck at first, then gave way with a groan. Inside, he found a tangle of garden hoses, a dented gas can, and a battered box of assorted tools. His hands rummaged through the box, sending nails and screws clattering. A hammer, a wrench, some pliers. He cursed under his breath, needing something far more lethal. Then he spotted a bulky shape leaning in the back corner. A mud-caked shotgun. A wave of relief washed over him. It might be old, maybe not even functional, but it was better than fists and a pocket knife against a werewolf. He seized it, checked the barrel, and felt his heart sink. No shells in sight. Desperate, he pawed through the cabinet shelves, knocking over an empty jar and some old license plates. He found a small box tucked behind the hoses. He tore it open. Shotgun shells. 2. He couldn't read the faded label in the dim light, but they felt like the right gauge. He stuffed both shells in his coat pocket and yanked the gun's pump to see if it would even move. The action felt stiff but not entirely jammed. A thunderous crash rocked the shed. The werewolf had slammed the door, splitting the top hinge. The bolt rattled, about to fail. Tony dropped to one knee, fumbling shells into the magazine tube. Every second counted, and his hands trembled. He managed to load the shells, pump the slide, and hear a reassuring click. He steadied himself, pointing the shotgun at the door. If that creature busted through, he'd have one shot, 2 if he was lucky, to stop it. The door crashed again, buckling inward. Thin moonlight flickered across the ragged edges of the boards. A huge claw appeared through a gash, ripping away splinters. Tony took aim, leveling the barrel at chest height. He realized the werewolf might not be alone. This was only one of the cursed beings, but focusing on that thought wouldn't help him now. He had to survive this immediate attack. A savage roar accompanied the door's final giving way. The werewolf tore through the broken barrier in a shower of splinters, its eyes locked on Tony, saliva dripping from a mouth full of teeth that seemed too large to fit in any earthly jaw. Tony fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. The muzzle flash lit the shed, revealing the beast's massive form in a frozen instant. The shot hit home, knocking the creature back a half step, but not toppling it. It roared with renewed fury, lurching forward. Tony pumped the shotgun for a second round, praying it wouldn't jam. He squeezed the trigger. Another explosion echoed inside the cramped shed. The blast struck the beast in the torso, throwing it backward into the splintered doorway. This time, it collapsed onto the threshold, letting out a rumbling groan. Tony could see its sides heaving, thick blood staining its fur. He didn't dare approach. The creature convulsed, limbs twitching. Then its head sagged. One last breath rattled from its open jaws, and the body slumped into stillness. Chest heaving, Tony lowered the shotgun, the acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with stale air. He was uncertain if the beast was truly dead. Some legends claimed werewolves were nearly indestructible. But the creature did not move. Blood oozed from the wounds, pooling on the dirty shed floor. Tony stepped to the side, edging closer to the shattered door, ready to run if it stirred again. but it remained motionless. At last, Tony let himself breathe. He wiped sweat from his brow, stared at the shotgun in his shaking hands, and felt a mix of triumph and horror. What if more lurked nearby? He would never escape a whole pack. Yet he had no choice but to keep searching for Lizzy. He took a step toward the yard, glancing over his shoulder one last time to confirm the beast still lay still. The night air hit him with a renewed chill, and a lingering sense of dread told him that his trials were far from over. Tony stood at the threshold of the shed, holding the empty shotgun in both hands. The werewolf's body blocked the splintered doorway, and the smell of blood mingled with the metallic scent of spent shells. He paused to check whether the creature's chest still moved. It did not. Its thick fur lay matted and soaked, and its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. Tony understood that time was precious. More of these monsters could appear, and he had no extra ammunition if another pack member emerged from the shadows. He stepped over the dead beast, clenching his teeth as he tried not to slip on the damp floor. Outside, the night air felt colder than before. A faint wind rustled the overgrown weeds, carrying the stench of gunpowder and wet fur. He surveyed his surroundings, aware that one wrong move could bring another confrontation. He kept the shotgun even though it held no shells. Perhaps its appearance alone would buy him a few seconds if confronted again. He moved toward the house where he could see a faint glow in a front window he did not recall leaving illuminated. Earlier, everything in that living room had been dim. Now, a subtle radiance flickered against the glass, and Tony wondered if he had triggered some hidden mechanism when he escaped through the rear door. He gripped the shotgun tighter, glancing from side to side. The yard was empty of any figures, although he felt eyes watching from distant corners. He reached the battered porch, noticing the wide smear of blood on the steps from the earlier struggle. The boards creaked under his weight, and he tested the doorknob. The door was still ajar. He nudged it open with the butt of the shotgun, peering inside. The living room remained cluttered and dusty, but the faint light emanated from a single lamp resting on a battered-end table. He saw no figure in the room, yet the sense of an unseen presence lingered. Something had turned on that lamp, and he doubted the electrical wires were still reliable in a neglected town like this one. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The lamp's feeble glow revealed the tattered sofa, the old photographs on the mantel, and a few scattered books on the floor. He scanned each corner, methodically checking for any threat. Nothing moved. He noticed the lamp's power cord stretched to a nearby outlet. This sight made little sense to him, given the condition of the house. He advanced slowly, holding the shotgun at waist level. He found a handwritten note lying next to the lamp. A few lines of rushed script read, "If you came back, you need to know. Go to Thomas Paine's place. Hurry." No name appeared on the paper, but the handwriting resembled Lizzy's. The letters tilted slightly to the left, and the pen strokes looked shaky. He felt his pulse quicken. Lizzy might still be alive, or perhaps someone else placed the note to lure him into a trap. Either way, he had no viable alternative if he hoped to learn the truth. He tucked the note into his pocket and checked the shotgun once more, confirming it was unloaded. He set it on the table, realizing it was of no practical use now. He pulled out the folding knife and wiped its blade on a torn piece of cloth from the floor. Although that small blade was next to worthless against towering creatures, he could not wander unarmed. He scanned the living room a final time, retrieving a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox he had overlooked. The tool felt solid enough to serve as a blunt weapon if necessary. He left the house and returned to the yard, stepping around the remains of the fence. In the distance, beyond the deserted street, he could see the faint outline of buildings near the town center. Thomas Paine's cafe was there, and Tony recalled the cautious approach he had made earlier when exploring that place. It had seemed empty at the time, but perhaps something had changed in these hours since. He started walking, his every movement accompanied by the distant rasp of dry grass. He passed several decrepit houses, all dark and silent. Fences leaned inward, and mailboxes lay on their sides. His shoes scuffed the pavement, echoing between boarded-up windows. He saw no signs of additional werewolves, but the hush felt ominous, as if an entire population watched him from unlit interiors. He tightened his grip on the wrench. Every shadow looked capable of concealing a muzzle and teeth. He eventually reached the small square where Thomas Paine's cafe stood. The old sign still hung at an angle, and the windows showed no light. Tony approached the entrance, a single wooden door with chipped paint. He twisted the knob. The door resisted, but then gave way, squeaking as it opened. He raised the wrench, preparing for an attack. The interior was as dark as before, yet he detected a smell of something metallic, perhaps old cooking grease mingled with recent sweat. He stepped inside and paused, letting his eyes adjust. Broken tables and chairs dotted the floor, and an overturned bar stool lay near the counter. Dried leaves and scraps of paper crunched underfoot. He recalled seeing Lizzy behind a cafe counter like this in more hopeful days, though that memory felt painfully distant. Now the place reeked of abandonment. He advanced toward the back room, where he had once glimpsed flickering movement through a dusty window. He reached a narrow hallway, noticing streaks of grime on the walls. A single door at the end showed a faint gap at its base, allowing a thread of light to spill onto the floor. He heard a quiet sound behind that door, possibly footsteps. He exhaled, bracing himself for the worst. He raised the wrench, nudged the door with his knee, and waited for whatever lay on the other side. Tony advanced down the dim hallway with the heavy wrench raised to chest level. He approached the door at the far end, noticing the narrow strip of yellowish light beneath it. The boards under his feet groaned with each step. He could feel his pulse throbbing behind his eyes, and his breathing came in short, tense bursts. He thought about the note that had urged him here, written in the same hand that once professed a longing for marriage and a small farm. He braced himself for any ambush, uncertain whether friend or foe waited beyond that door. He reached the threshold and tested the handle without pushing. The wood felt splintered, suggesting the door might stick. He tightened his grip on the wrench. The air smelled stale, and there was a faint, persistent hint of spoiled food somewhere behind him. A low hum echoed from the other side of the door, possibly a generator or a small appliance. He could not piece together the layout of this back room, having only walked these corridors briefly in the past. He took a moment to steady himself. He gave the handle a firm twist, then eased the door open. A rectangle of light spilled across the floor, illuminating cracked tiles and scattered papers. The smell of old grease lingered, and he spotted a large stove against one wall. Beyond that stove stood a figure with its back turned. That figure appeared motionless, except for shallow breathing that caused its shoulders to shift. The light came from a lone standing lamp near an overturned shelf. It flickered, hinting at faulty wiring or an improvised connection. Tony eased inside, wrench held high. He saw the figure was dressed in ragged jeans and a shirt smeared with dark stains. The person did not turn or acknowledge Tony, so he cleared his throat softly. He avoided raising his voice, wary of provoking a sudden reaction. The figure turned halfway, revealing a face drawn and pale. The eyes remained sunken, and the mouth twitched as though forming words. Tony recognized this man from past glimpses in Lycanthrope. He had stood near the fence when Tony first arrived, glaring with that same odd intensity. The man lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the stove's metal surface. Tony noticed a battered photograph taped there, its edges curling from grease and heat. The image showed a young woman with a gentle smile. Tony saw that it was Lizzy. He shifted his weight, struggling to contain a surge of emotion. He wanted to demand an explanation from this stranger. Instead, he waited, wrench still raised. The man spoke in a strained whisper. His words were halting, as if he fought to remember how to form sentences. He said Tony needed to leave the cafe. He said no one who lingered in Lycanthrope at night remained safe. He coughed, and his whole body shook with the effort. Tony watched his eyes dart toward a narrow door near the stove, as though revealing a passage or a hideout. Tony questioned him in a low tone, asking about Lizzy's whereabouts, but the man only repeated his command to leave. Tony stepped closer. He saw the man's arms, dotted with fresh lacerations. Claw marks scored his forearms, and an older wound on his shoulder seemed crudely bandaged. The man trembled as he leaned on the stove. Tony lowered the wrench slightly, wary that the stranger might transform if infected. The man gestured to the photo, then pressed his palm to the stove's surface. The expression on his face shifted between despair and resignation. Tony asked about Lizzy again. This time the man pointed at the smaller door near the stove and whispered a name. Thomas Paine. The voice cracked on those syllables, as though dredging up a memory too dark to face. Tony took a step in that direction, half expecting an attack from behind. But the man did not move. Tony tugged the door's handle and discovered a steep flight of steps descending into a basement. A damp odor wafted up, mixed with the distinct smell of mildew and rusted metal. He realized this might be where Thomas Paine carried out his secrets, hidden from daylight. He flicked the narrow beam of the overhead lamp downward, seeing rough concrete walls. The steps disappeared into thick shadows. He wanted to interrogate the wounded man further, but feared that time was slipping away. He edged onto the top stair, gripping the shaky banister. Each step sank slightly under his weight, and the air grew colder as he descended. Water dripped somewhere, forming a repetitive pattern that reminded him of leaky bunkers. Down below, he sensed a presence, though he could not see anything beyond the faint glow from above. Reaching the bottom, he found a low-ceilinged cellar filled with crates and tangled chains. A single bulb hung from the rafters, flickering. Tony scanned the cramped space, spotting a rusted table covered with tools and a row of empty cages along the far wall. The bars on those cages were bent in places, and the locks lay broken on the ground. He kept the wrench raised, expecting something to leap from behind the crates. He found no immediate threat, yet dread filled him at the sight of shredded clothing in one of the cages. He heard a muffled sound from a locked door at the back of the cellar. He pushed past scattered boxes to inspect it. The heavy padlock looked tampered with, scratched as if by desperate attempts to escape. He noticed dark smears that might have been blood. He wedged the wrench against the lock, applied pressure, and heard metal groan. It took 2 more tries before the lock snapped. He gripped the handle, yanked, and pulled the door open. Inside, Tony found a cramped chamber lit by a single lantern. Lizzy crouched in a corner, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes red from exhaustion. She looked thinner than he remembered, with bruises along her wrists and dark circles beneath her eyes. She lifted her gaze, recognized Tony, and tried to stand, but her legs trembled. He leaned forward to help her. Her breathing came in uneven bursts, as though she had fought panic for days on end. He carefully guided her out, supporting her weight with one arm, still gripping the wrench with the other. She clung to him, whispering that they had no time, that Thomas Paine and others would return soon. Tony noticed a bandage on her neck, stained with dried blood. She struggled to speak. He urged her to save her strength, then steered her toward the stairs, promising they would find a way out of this cursed place. He feared that any loud movement might summon more beasts, but he knew they had to risk it. They reached the foot of the steps. Lizzy stumbled, so he tightened his hold and helped her climb. He realized the man upstairs might still be there, or he might have changed. He pressed forward anyway, refusing to abandon Lizzy again. He remembered the nights he had survived overseas, the grueling marches and the chaos of war. None of that measured up to the dread he felt here, guiding her up the crumbling stairway in a town overrun by nightmares. Tony helped Lizzy climb the worn steps, keeping one arm firmly around her waist so she would not collapse. Her breathing came in dry, shallow bursts, and he felt how each step tested her diminished strength. He thought about the new scars on her wrists and the bandage near her neck. He sensed how desperately she needed rest, but they had little time to linger. At the top of the stairway, the wounded man was gone, and the area lay in silence. The small lamp in the corner flickered, casting fitful light across the cracked tiles. Tony guided Lizzy toward the doorway. She leaned against him, speaking in a hushed voice about Thomas Paine. She struggled to tell him that Paine had led a group of townspeople deeper into the curse that plagued Lenville. They had become half-beasts, terrorizing anyone who tried to leave. Lizzy had resisted, which led to her confinement in that damp chamber. Tony gripped the wrench more tightly, aware that any moment might bring a final confrontation. He listened to her fractured words, piecing them together as best he could. She had seen him fight in the yard and knew he had wounded at least one creature, maybe more. He pushed open the cafe's back door, guiding Lizzy into the same corridor through which he had entered. The hallway smelled of stale grease and rotting wood. The battered stove stood in place, and the taped photograph of Lizzy remained on its stained surface. The overhead bulb flickered. Tony glanced around, seeing no sign of Thomas Paine or the man who had pointed at Lizzy's picture. Lizzy's gaze fell on the photograph, and she raised a trembling hand, as though seeing a fragment of another life. Tony braced her against a wall and inched forward to check the exit leading outside. Before he reached it, footsteps pounded on the other side, and a loud crash signaled a forced entry. The door shuddered as if struck by a powerful shoulder. Tony stepped back, gripping the wrench at shoulder level. Lizzy stood upright, though her face remained pale. A heavy impact pounded the door, ripping it from its top hinge. Splinters flew into the corridor, and Thomas Paine appeared in the gap. He towered above Tony, arms and shoulders straining against the torn remains of a work shirt. Coarse hair covered his forearms, and his teeth looked unnaturally long. His eyes reflected a cunning that rose above raw, bestial anger. He stared at Lizzy, letting a rumbling growl roll from his chest. She recoiled, recognizing the same look that had haunted her since her captivity. Tony stood between them, raising the wrench. Thomas Paine let out a low snarl, half-formed words emerging from his mouth. He accused Lizzy of betrayal. He glared at Tony with open hostility, as if Tony's presence alone was an unforgivable challenge. Tony tightened his stance. He knew his weapon was hardly enough to stop a being of Paine's size and strength, but he also sensed that Paine had not fully shifted. The man still hovered in that in-between state, fur bristling along his arms, yet shaped by a malicious intelligence. Tony planned his strike. Payne lunged, swinging a powerful arm. Tony dove sideways, colliding with the edge of the stove, sending a clatter of metal utensils to the floor. Lizzy cried out, but Payne ignored her, intent on crushing Tony. Tony rolled and regained his footing. He gripped the wrench with both hands and swung at Payne's side. The metal connected, releasing a sharp crack. Payne staggered but did not fall. He bellowed, baring his teeth in a silent snarl that made Tony's blood freeze. He advanced again, grabbing Tony's shoulder with a massive grip. Tony felt claws dig into his skin, piercing through his shirt. He drove the wrench upward, smashing Payne's forearm. The blow loosened the creature's grip enough for Tony to wrench himself free. Lizzy clutched a broken broom handle lying on the floor and hurled it at Payne. The makeshift spear struck his back, provoking another furious roar. Tony saw his chance and slammed the wrench into Payne's ribcage. Payne staggered a second time, his features distorted further, and coarse hair spread from his shoulders to his neck. A frenzied light glowed in his eyes. He lunged a final time, arms wide, trying to seize Tony in a crushing grip. Tony braced himself and swung the wrench full force at Payne's temple. The impact reverberated through Tony's arms. Payne lurched backward, stumbling against the stove. He toppled sideways, hitting the tiled floor with enough weight to crack a section of it. He lay motionless, blood seeping from the wound. Tony allowed himself a trembling breath, pressing a hand to the torn fabric on his shoulder. The corridor fell silent, aside from Lizzy's uneven breathing. Payne did not move. Tony kept the wrench raised, just in case, until he saw no trace of further movement. He turned to Lizzy, catching her just before her knees buckled. She leaned against him, eyes closing from exhaustion. He saw the bandage on her neck was bleeding again, and he knew they had to leave before more of these twisted inhabitants arrived. He helped her reach the door, stepping over Payne's body. Outside, the night air felt thin and cold. Tony noticed the sky brightening at the horizon, a faint promise of sunrise. Lizzy clung to him as they crossed the deserted square, the hush broken only by a distant howl. Their clothes bore blood and grime. They had no vehicle, but they had survived. He recalled the policeman's warning in Windhead and how no one wanted to speak openly about Lycanthrope. Now he understood everything. The silent watchers, the locked doors, the empty streets. It all led to this dangerous secret. They headed for the main highway, moving slowly but determined. Tony refused to look back at the half-ruined buildings. He felt no triumph in what he had done. He only felt relief that Lizzy was alive, that they had escaped the darkness before it swallowed them both. Every joint in his body ached, and he suspected Lizzy's wounds needed proper care. They still had miles to travel, and he did not know if more creatures followed. Yet he walked on, supporting her with steady arms, refusing to abandon hope. They vanished into the early morning light, leaving the cursed town behind, each step guided by the instinct to live and to protect what remained of their future.